Hello friends, welcome to CEC live lectures. So we will be continuing our discussion from the previous lecture, which was on protocols, and we had discussed the main elements of the World Wide Web. In that we had discussed about what is a server, what is a web client, what is web server, what are the different parts of the browser, and we had talked about the different types of documents, web documents, right? Now in this part we are going to talk about the specific protocols that are used. So the first and the foremost protocol which one wants to know about when you are looking at the World Wide Web is of course the hypertext transfer protocol, which is commonly known as the HTTP protocol. So basically HTTP protocol is used to define how client server programs will be written and retrieved and will be used basically to retrieve web pages from the web, right? So basically the architecture remains the same, that is the client will send a request and the server will send a return as a response, right? So the server, we all know now that the server will use the port number 80 for sending the response, and the client will use a temporary port number for sending or communicating with the server. So HTTP basically it uses the services of TCP, and we all know that TCP is a connection oriented protocol which is very reliable. We had seen that connection oriented protocols, they are more secure protocols because they have error check, and they have correction, etc. They have multiple features which make them more protocol. So this means that connection oriented means that before any transaction between the client and server will take place, a connection has to be established between them, and once the transaction is completed, the connection will also be terminated. So client and server, they don't have to worry about errors in the message also, because if there is any loss or if there is any error, then TCP, because of the connection oriented nature of the TCP, it will take care of any kind of errors which have happened, any kind of drop in the message which has happened, and it will take necessary actions to rectify that mistake. So when we are talking about HTTP connections, then we say that there are two main types of connections which are established on HTTP for in an HTTP communication. So the first type we say is a non-persistent connection, and the second is known as a persistent connection. So what we are looking at is that when web pages, they are looking for objects. So when objects are to be retrieved, they could be located on the same server or they could be located on different servers. So if the web pages or objects which are retrieved, they are located on different servers, then definitely we don't have a choice and we have to create new TCP connection for retrieving each object. So if you have if you want to talk to three different servers, obviously you will need three different types of connection, three different connections to be established for retrieving the objects from there. The point is when you have multiple objects to be retrieved from the same server, okay, then if you have two choices, if you want to have multiple connections, if you want to have multiple objects from the same server, you can either go for a non-persistent connection. That is, non-persistent means that for retrieving each object, you will use a new TCP connection. Or you can go for a persistent connection, that is, you will make a TCP connection and you will retrieve all the objects through this single TCP connection. Right. So we are going to look at the pros and cons, and we'll see that which type of connection will be more suited when you are trying to retrieve multiple objects from the same server. So if we look at non-persistent connections, basically, so what we are looking at is that one TCP connection will be made for each request or response. Okay, so we are, what are the steps which will be followed? So first step will be that the client will open a TCP connection and it will send a request to the server. The server will send the response and it will close the connection, the client will read the data which has come from the server, and when it will see the end of file marker, then it will close the connection. So in this type of strategy, basically, if a file contains links to n different pictures in different files, right, of course all are on the same server, but different files are there. So for n pictures you will need n plus 1 connections to be opened and to be closed, right. So non-persistent strategy is, a very expensive strategy, because it imposes a very high overhead on the server, because you understand that for every connection you will have plus 1 number of buffers which have to be maintained. Okay, there are different variables which have to be allocated, and therefore a large amount of server resources have to be allocated. So therefore this creates a burden on both the sides, and more so on the server side, because the server has to maintain the buffer and the variables, the state for each connection which has been opened, right. So in this diagram also we can see that for every connection, say for the first thing, when a file is to be exchanged, so there are, the request is going from the client, the response is coming from the server, and then again the client is sending a request to close the connection. So therefore if you have two files or which you need to access, so you can see that there is, there are 3 connections which have to be started and which have to be terminated, right. So this creates a lot of overhead. Whereas in case of persistent connections, like in the latest version in HTTP, that is version 1.1, it specifies persistent connections by default. Now the word persistent means that the connection will be left open for more requests after sending a response. So in this case, when a client sends a request to the server, the connection is established, but the server does not terminate the connection soon after servicing one request. Okay, it will keep the connection open either till the timeout or till the time the client says request for the connection to close, right. So usually the sender will send the length of the data with each response. However, there are some occasions when the sender does not know the length of the data. In that case, what will happen, that a document is created dynamically or actively. So then the end of file is not known. So before sending, the server cannot say that what is the length of data that will be sent. So then what happens is that the server will inform the client that the length is not known, and it will close the connection after sending the data. So what happens, the client will know that the end of data has also reached. So time and resources are saved using persistent connection. Why? Because only one set of buffer and variable needs to be set for connection at each side. For one connection, you will have only one buffer, you will have only one set of variables, and therefore the round trip time for connection establishment and connection termination is also saved. Because in case of non-persistent, what happens is that for every object you need a separate connection. So first you have to send request for establishment of connection, then the data will come, then the request will go, then the response will come, and then the connection termination will go. Whereas in this case, there is only once that the connection is opened, once it is terminated, and in between all the exchange will take place. So here you can see in this diagram that only once there is a request for opening, the connection is established and a request is sent by the client. The server sends the response. After this, the client is not having to request for another connection because the connection is already open. So it will now only send the request and receive only the response. After the response has been received, then the client will request for the termination of connection. So on the request of the client, the server will terminate the connection. Till the time the client is not sending a termination request, the connection will be kept open by the server. So therefore we know that non-persistent the persistent connections are more friendly, they are less cumbersome, and they impose less overhead on the server, particularly on the server. So they can, they lead to fast communication, faster round trip time, and better efficiency between the client server communications. Now if we look at the message formats, so HTTP protocol, basically when we are saying request and response, so there is a specific format for the request and response messages. So each message, whether it is a request or a response, it has got 4 sections. So the first section in the request message is called as the request line, and the first section in the response message will be known as the status line. The rest 3 sections, that is the head, the blank line and the body, they are the same. Okay, so however we need to also know that in only the names of the 3 sections are same, that is head, blank line and body, but again the content will be very different. The content in the head and the body of the request will be different from the content of the head and the body of the response. So very important to understand what is the format of a request and what is the format of a response message. So the first line in case of a request message, as we have seen, is known as the request line. Then you have the header line, then there is a blank line, and then finally there is a body. Now in the request line, if we look at the request line, so there is of course 3 attributes which we can see here. The first attribute is the method attribute, then is the URL, and the third is the version, and in between these two of course there is blank space and you have end of line statement. So what are these method, URL and version? Let's see. So in the request message we can see that in the method you can have the different methods in which information is going to be sent, okay, in which the request is going to be sent. So the most common method which is used is known as the get method. Okay, so get method is used to send a request to the server, and in this case the body of the message is empty, right? So the second field is the URL, which defines the address and the name of the corresponding web page. Whatever web page is being requested, that URL goes in the URL field. And the third field of course is the version, which is the current version of HTTP, so that will have version 1.1. After the request line there is a request header line. So each header line will send additional information from the client to the server. So for example, the client can request the document in a special format, right? So each header line will have a colon, a space and a header value. So the header value is going to determine what are the special attributes which the client is sending along with the request. So in the header, you can have user agent, accept char set. So these are the different fields which the header information can connect, which it can use to send it to the server. Then is the structure of the response message. So response message is what? Response is what the server is sending to the client. So again the response message also has got 4 parts. So the first part is known as the status line. The other 3 part, that is the header, the blank line and sometimes a body is also there. Those are similar to the request message only. So the status line or the first line of the response message, it also has got 3 fields. The first field is known as the version. So version again means the version of the HTTP protocol, which is obviously 1.1. Then you have the status code. Now the status code field is important in a response message because it will define the status of the request which the server is sending a response to. So it contains 3 digits basically, and it shows, the 3 digits, they have their own significance. So if it is an informational request, the range is starting from 1. If it is a successful request, the range starts from 200. If it is a redirect the client to another URL, then the request code is 300. So likewise, you have multiple request codes, and a request phrase is also there, which explains the status code in the text form. So whatever is the status code, like 100, 200, 300, etc., that is also explained in a text form, in a phrase form, along with the response message. So after the status line, of course, we can have one, or we can no header lines at all, or we can have more than one header line also in the response message. So again, header here also is used for sending additional information from the server to the client. For example, the sender can send extra information about the document, right? So each header will have a header name, a colon, a space, and a header value. Now the body contains the main document which is going to be sent. So the last part in the response message format is the body, which is present unless the response is an error message. So body is basically the main document or the main web page which has to be sent to the server, unless of course there is a problem and some error message is to be sent. Like many times we see error message 404 is coming. So 404 means this is an error and the web page could not be loaded due to any reasons. So different types of header informations is there. Then one very important type of request message which we see is a conditional request message. So what is a conditional request from a client? That is, a client is adding a condition in the request, and the server will only send the requested web page if the particular condition is met. Okay, and if it is not met, then the client will be informed by the server that why the particular web page is not being sent. So one of the most common conditions imposed by the client is the time and date of the web page, right? Say for example, the client is looking for a web page which was modified not before 1 year, right? So then this client can send the header file if modified since. Right. So this is going to be a condition, and it will tell the server that it will only send the pages if they were modified after 1 year. If they were modified before 1 year, then those pages need not be sent. So in this format, in the header format, the client can send the client can send a conditional request to the server. Right. So after this, we talk about, after we have looked at the message formats, now we also need to look at a very important aspect that is, related to the World Wide Web, that is known as cookies. Right. So the cookies basically, the World Wide Web, when it was initially designed, it was designed as a stateless entity, because the idea was only to share information with a large audience, and the information was available publicly, and only exact fitting documents would be returned. But today, it's not just information exchange and not just sharing of documents which is happening on the web page, but a large number of other activities like commercial activities or selling and buying, etc., are also taking place here. So therefore, it is important that this information about the clients is available with the servers. So like for example, there are websites which are used as electronic stores. So they need to allow the users to, look through the store, browse through the store, select items, put them in a cart, pay at the end, and, all these activities. So there are many websites which only allow access to registered clients, right? Some websites, they are portals. Right, so they will only, the user will select the web pages which the user wants to see. Some websites are just advertising agencies. So there are different, purposes for which websites are these days they are being used. And for all these purposes, the cookie mechanism was devised. Right. So basically, what is cookie, the cookie is a file which is created by the server, but it is stored on the client side. Right. So it is said that the cookie is created by the server and it is consumed by the server only. So the creation and storing of cookies, it depends on the implementation, but the principle behind the cookie creation is the same. So what is and how the cookies are created? Basically, when a server receives a request from a client, it stores the information about the client in a file or a string. Now this information may include the domain name of the client, the content of the cookie, okay. So the information which the server has gathered about the client, like the name, registration number or choice, okay, timestamp, etc., and other information depending upon the implementation. So every client, every server can have different configuration of creating cookies, but this basic mechanism, the broad mechanism, remains the same. So the server includes the cookie in the response and then it sends that to the client. Now when the client receives the response, the browser will store the cookie in the cookie directory, which is stored by the server domain name. So the cookies are basically not visible to the user, but they are only readable by the browser and the server. So once this information is stored on the server, then next time when a client sends a request to the server, so browser will first look in the cookie directory, and if it sees that a cookie has been created by the server, so now this cookie will be sent along with the request. Now when the server will see the request, it will know that okay, this is an old client, not a new client, and then the content of the cookie will be used by the server only. So therefore it is said that it is only read by the browser and it is not disclosed to the user. So it's a cookie which is made by the server and eaten by the server only. So cookie can be used for multiple purposes, like for e-commerce websites, right? So e-commerce websites, again, as we just discussed, these are electronic stores, right? So they can use a cookie for client shoppers. So when a client selects an item and inserts it in a cart, a cookie that contains information about the item such as its number, its unit price, is sent to the browser. If the client selects a second item, the cookie is updated with the new selection information and so on. So when the client finishes shopping and wants to check out, the last cookie retrieved and total charges calculated. So whenever an online shopping is happening, it's basically the cookie which is being updated constantly by the server, okay, and the last state of the cookie is what is read by the server. So the site which there are sites which restrict access to registered clients, right? So they also, what they do is that they send a cookie to the client when the client registers for the first time. For any repeated access, only those clients that send the appropriate cookie are allowed. So therefore the site would know by reading the cookie, by getting the information from the cookie, that this is a registered client or not. So likewise we have web portals, right? So web portals are what these are very specific websites which provide multiple functionalities just besides just showing the content to the user. So web portals also they use cookies in similar way. So when a user selects the favorite pages, so cookie is made and sent. If the site is accessed again, the cookie is sent to the server to show what the client is looking for. So the client would actually, the server would actually know that what are the likes and dislikes of the client on the particular web portal. So automatically those pages will be shown. Another very important application which is used in somewhat negative sense also by the advertising agencies. So cookie is used very commonly by online advertising agencies, which basically they place ads, banner ads on the main website, which are often visited by the user. Say for example, if you often go to a particular social media website, so you will see that similar kinds of ads are appearing. So how does this work? The advertising agency supplies only a URL that gives the advertising agency's address instead of the banner itself. So when a user visits the main website and clicks the icon of a corporation, a request is sent to the advertising agencies. So the advertising agency sends the requested banner, but it also includes a cookie with the ID of the user. So now any future use of the banner adds to the database that profiles the web behavior of the user. So the advertising agency has compiled the interest of the user, and then they can sell this information to other parties. So this use, this particular use of cookies has made them very controversial, because they are sort of invading the privacy of the user, and they are sharing the browsing pattern and the browsing history of the user with third party agencies. So therefore this particular application of the cookies has come under a lot of criticism, and we hope that new regulations will be devised so that the privacy of the users on the World Wide Web is preserved and is maintained. So we will be continuing our discussion on other client server protocols in the following lectures. Till then, please keep watching CEC live lectures. Thank you.